Hello, my name is Kieran Trinan. I'm a current genetic counseling student here at the Keck Graduate Institute, and today I'm interviewing Miss Suraman. Uh,
hmm
would you like to introduce yourself to everybody?
Sure. So I'm Mai Ceremony, and I have been working in industry, the pharmaceutical drug development industry, as a drug developer and industry researcher, specifically in clinical research and regulatory, the regulatory aspect of it for about 25 years. And I've had a chance to develop drugs and take it to commercialization for a number of indications, including pain as well as rare diseases. So I'm happy to be here to answer any questions that you might have and share some insights
Yeah,
about the
thank
genetic
you
landscape.
so much for volunteering your time today to speak with me. And apologies for mispronouncing your name. I wasn't 100% sure.
No problem.
But yeah, I guess the first set of questions I have are kind of just like personal stuff. Um, my first question I have for you is, do you consider yourself to be like a woman in STEM? That's like a big label in my generation of students, I feel like.
So I don't consider myself to be a woman in STEM, and partly is because in my generation, I don't actually understand what that means.
Okay.
But I
Yeah.
think so. So I think for me, what I'm someone I develop drugs, right? So I use science, and by science I mean everything from discovery, right? What the chemists and people in preclinical do to first discover a compound and take it through what we call preclinical investigation, which is through, pharmacology, understanding how the drug works from a pharmacokinetic, pharmacodynamic perspective, as well as toxicology, because anytime you develop a drug anywhere in the world, you have to ensure that you have appropriate toxicology data to support the safety profile of the drug before you even take it into humans. And then there's a very fascinating aspect of all of that development process called translational science. And this is where you take that compound and you really try to understand the mechanism of action of the drug. And you can do it in vitro or in vivo in animal studies, particularly in mouse studies and things of that nature. And you want to know, how does the drug work relative to the underlying pathophysiology of the disease? And how will that translate? And this is where the translational science comes to clinical outcome measures that you're evaluating in your studies, your clinical trials, right?
Yeah.
So all of that goes there. And I, as part of someone who has to participate in the development process overall, those are processes that I'm aware of and support in a cross-functional multidisciplinary team environment. But what I do is then I take it from all of those people and then I take it into phase 1 to phase 3 research to support registration, and then phase 3B to phase 4 once the drug is out on the market, and we continue to do what we call post-marketing safety surveillance studies and other things. So from that standpoint, I use a lot of science, I use a lot of data, I use a lot of stats. I interact with what we call key opinion leaders, so clinical science and experts around the world who specialize in whatever therapeutic area. So I guess I am a woman of STEM, actually, now that I'm talking out loud.
That's what I was thinking as well. Like, I mean, I know it's kind of a newer term for you, but I would say
I'm old. I'm
the
old. So those, yeah,
criteria.
that term doesn't resonate.
No, no, you didn't hear it
Back
from
in my
me.
day, yeah. So, but I would say yes, actually.
Cool. Yeah. I guess just to highlight some of what you said, or like riff off of what you said, translational research is something that is like exciting for me, but I feel like it's sort of hard to get into as a student. So like, when I'm a professional, I'm hoping to one day, work on something in that realm. But everything you talked about like bringing drugs to trial is like essentially what my undergrad was about in biotech. Uh,
Mhm.
so I'll ask some questions about that, but I'm more interested in sort of just your big picture ideas, I guess, and like
Mhm.
perspectives from like the business standpoint.
Mhm. So
Uh,
I think that's a very broad question. So I think we need to
yeah,
know.
no, that's not my question. I'm just
Okay,
like
yeah.
kind of
So you're
preface.
laying the framework for this. So do you have a specific question around that, or?
Yeah, so let's see here. Just to riff off of that, in terms of like rare disease, right? And just genetics in general, I feel like just how the system is set up is not really conducive for like preventative healthcare.
Mhm.
So I guess in your opinion, from like all of your experience, what changes, like big or small, do you think need to occur to kind of make preventative healthcare like a ubiquitous thing as like a
Okay.
systemic change?
Yeah, so I think they're first and foremost, I can't answer that question, right? So I can
Sure,
give you,
yeah,
yeah, so I can give you, because no one can answer that question. No one that you talk
yeah,
to on the
yeah,
face of this earth actually can give you a definitive answer to that question. So I
yeah,
think what I can do is I can give you some insights, right?
sure,
And
sure,
perspectives based on my understanding of the genetic landscape, okay? And it's going to tie into everything, right? It's going to tie into sort of the basic sciences work. It's going to tie into what industry does. It's going to tie into what genetic counselors and medical geneticists and academia does and physicians do, right? And
yeah,
I think it's too hard, especially for this first conversation, to really hone in on the nitty gritty. So I'm going to do
uh,
my best to try to hit a few
sure,
highlights. Okay,
sure,
because I think that's the best way to approach it, actually, even for myself as I'm thinking aloud.
yeah,
Um, so I'm going to talk to you sort of in terms of offering up some guidance on how you should think about approaching researching the genetic
yeah,
landscape. Okay, so I'm going to start there. Let's talk about the genetic landscape, right?
mhm,
So you understand that a genetic disease
mhm,
falls generally under the category of what we call a rare disease, right?
right,
And it's a rare disease by what we call prevalence. Okay. It's how many patients are affected. Let's say the US prevalence of a rare disease, whether it's PMM or it's Lahone or Lee syndrome or whatever it is, you want to know in the United States what that US prevalence is, right? So,
mhm,
for example, in PMM, I just recently tried to develop a drug for that patient population. The
mhm,
prevalence of that is 1 in 20,000 patients, right? Which is very different than 1 in 20 patients, right? Which is a much broader, bigger therapeutic disease or indication. So it's
just
first
if
and
I
foremost,
may, I think 1 in 20,000 is actually pretty common in the context of rare disease. I think
yeah.
like the definition is like it has to be like 1 in 200,000 to be, a rare disease by definition.
So that's the definition by regulatory, that so the regulatory definition of 1 in 200,000 or 300,000 gets
Yeah.
you what's called a very specific designation when you're developing a drug called
Okay.
the orphan designation.
Right. I was going to
So it
ask
has
you
to
about
be, so
orphan
it
drugs
has to be
specifically.
under 300,000, right? So
Mhm.
so this is where this is really important because there is the literature and scientific definition of rare disease and what the scientific community puts out, which what you'll see is 1 in 20,000, which is, but there's the regulatory definition that a pharmaceutical company or a biotech company needs to meet in order to get a very special regulatory pathway designation called an orphan designation. And that's the one out of 300, that's the
Yeah,
$300,000
the bigger number.
cutoff,
Yeah.
right? Patient
Gotcha.
cutoff. So
Yeah.
when you're thinking about this, you have to understand who your audiences are, right?
Interesting.
If
Yeah.
you're speaking to a clinician and you're speaking to scientists at academia, right? You're using the 1 out of 20,000 because that's their language. If
Right.
you're talking to the FDA and you're trying to negotiate to get approval for an orphan designation, you
Mhm.
better meet that 300,000 requirement, right? Or less,
Mhm.
right? So it's really important to understand the distinction of,
It's something I never have heard of in that context. So that's really
yeah, no, and you wouldn't, right? You wouldn't because you've never developed drugs for a pharmaceutical company, right? So
interesting.
that's why that's really important, and knowing your audience is really important. So one of the things I've learned in 25 years is depending on who I speak to, the data
Yeah.
and the statistics and the messaging actually will be varied, you know?
Interesting.
Um, so I think that's a really, so again, going back to rare diseases. So because
Yeah.
the prevalence is so low,
Yeah.
the FDA gives you this orphan designation. It gives you an incentive. The FDA generally and regulatory gives companies an incentive to develop the drug because it's really, really hard. Why is it hard? Why is it hard for a company to
I
develop?
mean, just from my perspective, right? It's so
Mhm.
rare. Why would a company want to spend all this money to bring a drug to trial for like a very low population of people, unless they're doing it for multiple, orphan drugs in like a portfolio where you're
Mhm.
trying to develop like, I don't know, hundreds of these types of drugs.
Mhm.
But yeah,
So,
that's
so
something I'm curious about.
Yes, I'll tell you why. Okay, developing a drug for a small indication and a small population takes the same amount of work, team effort, money, resources as it does to develop a drug for a big patient population or a, sort of a mainstream, more mainstream.
Mhm.
And the hurdles around developing a drug for a rare disease, that's different than developing a drug for migraine or obesity or high blood pressure, high cholesterol, something like that. Is there's very little information around the disease. So
Mhm.
there's very little information around the natural history of the disease and how that occurs, the disease progression, the manifestations of signs and symptoms. When you think about sort of even just people who treat the rare disease, there are few and far in between. So
Yeah.
in the United States, if you're looking at PMM, there are probably about, a handful of centers of excellence that you can go to. So patients will travel from Iowa to Florida to
Okay.
go
I'll
see a
give you a
PMM
real
expert.
example of this if you want.
Yeah.
Because I knew this interview was coming up, so I was asking my teacher, like, "Hey, do you know what primary mitochondrial myopathies are?" And she's studied like Huntington's pretty much
Mm-hmm.
her whole life, and
Mm-hmm.
she was like, honestly, I don't. Like, I'm sure there's like a chapter or something about it, but a lot of what I learned about it came from ChatGPT. Like, I'll be full disclosure about that. Like, that's honestly the best way for me to learn new
And
topics.
if you ask any what we call key opinion leader or world expert on PMM, and there's one actually out of Texas that I worked very closely with, she is the number one in the United States. And I asked her, so how did you come about becoming a center of excellence? Why are you an expert? And
Yeah.
she said it was really, I didn't learn it in medical school. I
Mhm.
didn't learn it through, residency. It was basically through an interest, a research interest. It was a self-teaching through literature review, ongoing upkeep of literature review. And again, just sort of empirically and anecdotally, because of her research interest, she happened to open her clinic to see patients and to learn about it. So a lot of it was self-taught.
I think another
And then so
thing you
there's a
could add
small
to
group
that
of them.
list is potentially
Yeah.
like having like a personal connection to that disease too, maybe for
Yeah,
people.
absolutely. And that's a huge sort of incentive, for these. But then there's then a small group of them that come together that declare themselves, quite honestly, we are the experts and
Right,
we are the centers of excellence that
right.
you should go to for whatever, if you're referring patients or if you're trying to do, industry research because you're trying to develop a drug or whatever it is, this is where you should go. Right.
Yeah.
So going back to the hurdles, that's a big hurdle, right? And so you have the kind of like, okay, and then when you're trying, so, and then the other part of that is the heterogeneity. So in rare genetic disorders, just the heterogeneity of the clinic, how the diseases progresses and the manifestation of signs
Well,
and
yeah,
symptoms,
we can use
right?
PMM as an example, right? I mean,
Yep.
it can be like cardiac, it can be endocrine, it can be neurological. There's like
Mhm.
so many systems that can be impacted, but also can't be impacted.
Right. So it's because the mitochondria, right, are found everywhere, especially in high energy consuming organs like the brain, the heart, your GI area, your liver, your skeletal muscles. And that's
Mhm.
why when a patient presents with PMM,
Mhm.
the patient journey. Okay, so something very important in genetics is the patient journey,
We call
where
it
they
the
start and where
diagnostic
they end.
odyssey.
The
Yeah.
diagnostic odyssey, because they can see 20 experts before they actually finally get a genetic test and finally
Mhm.
get the right diagnosis. Okay. And then where do you refer them at that point? Because the person who diagnosed them may not be necessarily have the
Mhm.
training or the expertise to treat them. So
Mhm.
that diagnostic journey becomes incredibly important. And PMM is in particular because, again, it involves the mitochondria, which is, everywhere.
Yeah.
So the multi-system impact and involvement and how that manifests in each patient. And the other thing too is, it's maternally sort
Right.
of inherited, right?
Mhm.
So I've met a number of families. So patient advocacy is very important, as you know, in rare,
Yeah.
so there's so many, depending on what the disease is, there are patient advocacy groups out there that
Yeah.
are there as support systems to
Do
patients.
you
You know,
work with Nord at all by chance?
yeah, so yep,
Yeah.
Nord is a
They're the
big
one I'm
one.
most familiar with.
Yeah, Nord is the big one, but then even within the disease itself,
Yeah.
right? So Nord is really big and it's around regulatory policy is Nord.
Mhm.
So for example, primary mitochondrial myopathies and those types of mitochondrial disorders, the
Mhm.
number one patient advocacy group in the United States is called the United Mitochondrial Disease Foundation, UMDF, right?
Mhm.
And they're big. They're the biggest advocacy group. They have an annual meeting every year, which is phenomenal that they pull people together. Patients come, their families come. Um, but I think, you know, that's really important. So patient advocacy and you know, kind of understanding that aspect
Yeah.
of rare genetic, because, you know, patients, I have never met smarter patients than patients with rare
Yeah.
genetic diseases
Right.
because they teach themselves and they learn because you know what? There's no one advocating for them out there. They have to serve as the mothers have to advocate for their children, the children have to advocate for the mothers, the spouses. There's nobody else advocating as strongly as they are. And they're so smart. They know their disease better than doctors know their disease.
Yeah. In
So
terms of patient advocacy, that's something that is a big deal for us as genetic counselors. But as I understand it, you were at the NSGC conference this
mhm.
past year. Is
No, I
that
think it was yeah, 2 years ago in Tennessee, the one in Tennessee.
okay?
Yeah.
Is that when you're there talking to only genetic counselors, I'm assuming, is that sort of to just bring awareness to us about this disease, or is that like to bring awareness of your drug development?
Yeah, so that meeting is a combination of labs, genetic labs, right? So they showcase
Right. We
and
need
they
to know who to
yeah.
order
So
from.
part of it, and as an industry person, we're looking at including genetic testing. You know, and so one of the things you want to do is you want to identify what's called a central lab or, you know, a single lab that can support, you know, so part of the reason why I'm there is for that. The other
Mhm.
part of the reason why I'm there is to connect with my clinical and scientific advisors that I
Mhm.
work with, meet new clinical scientific advisors that I work with. And then that meeting is very heavy in second year students in master's program
Yeah.
in genetic counseling masters. I mean, I think I can't even, I can't, don't quote me on the numbers, but I think it's
Yeah.
more than half
Yeah.
that, you know, are really just students. And
Right.
so I ended up meeting a lot of students that came up to me and
Mhm.
kind of wanted to know sort of what you're wanting to know. But
Mhm.
equally, you know, I was asking them because they come from different academic institutions, you
Yeah.
know, how you guys would, you know, do you see patients? Do you guys see patients at your institutions? Do you see patients with PMM? And,
Mhm.
you know, could you refer? You know, is there a network for which, you know, physicians that you're using that you could refer into a clinical trial? So sort of it was a mutual kind of discussion.
Yeah.
But it's the meeting for, you know, second year students to
Right.
go to. The other big medical conference is ACMG, which is the American College of you know, medical
Like what
genetics.
you yeah.
And yeah, and that's the big one that, you
Yeah.
know, I go to or, you know, I used to go to and people would go to.
Cool. Um, yeah, I guess I definitely want to return to like zooming in on PMM and
Mhm.
just like whatever, like, because to me, the hardest part still to understand is just like how it works as like a business model to like, you know, set out to make a drug like that.
Mhm.
In your,
So,
yeah.
yeah. Yeah, so there are a couple of things that you look at. So from a business perspective, anytime we look at an asset, we call it an asset. So anytime we look at an asset, and that asset could be a medical device, it
Mhm.
could be a biologic, it could be a small molecule, right? Pharmacologic, it could be a like nanotechnology. It could be any of those things. So we look at assets as a company, and a couple of things that we look at relative to the asset. That's really, real important to um, help you determine if it's something that you should pursue. So the
Mhm.
first thing we want to look at is, you know, so you have to look at the disease, you look at the prevalence, right? Because that tells you what the market size is going to be, right? Is it big or small,
So you
right?
can like somewhat estimate how much money is to be made
What
from
the revenue is,
yeah.
right? What the revenue is. And there are commercial people. So this is marketing, by the way. So there are commercial people that are constantly doing financial modeling around
Yeah.
this. So it's called the commercial strategy. So you have to have marketing people sitting at a table with
Yeah.
you to have run all of those numbers
Mhm.
in different countries, because what you sell a drug in US is very different than what you sell for a drug for in
Right.
Europe or
Sure.
Italy or Germany or whatever, right?
All the rules are
So
different,
so
right?
at the table, you have marketing people, you have market research, you have market analysts, you have commercial strategy, global strategic marketing, you have those people because they have
Mhm.
to come to the table with that. You also have your general business administration people, what you call your patent people, right? Because
Mhm.
you need to understand if you're going to bring in a drug, how strong the patent is. Is the
Mhm.
patent going to expire next year? Because if it's going to take you 6 years to develop a drug or 10 years to develop a drug and the patent expires next year, there's no business value in that, right? So the patent life and understanding what we call the patent portfolio is
Mhm.
incredibly important. So you bring in your patent lawyers and you
Yeah.
bring in your, business development, BD people, and they're sitting at the table. Then
Right.
you have to understand regulatory wise, what are the hurdles of getting this drug approved in the US, by the EMA in Europe,
Mhm.
by TGA in Australia, by Health Canada in Canada, whatever,
Doesn't
right?
like South
So
America
you bring
have
in your
that.
team of regulatory strategists and
Yeah.
people, and they come sit in a room,
Right.
right? And then you're like, well, how do you even design a study? Like, how do you look at the clinical? So you bring in me,
Yeah.
right? And I'm sitting there with the clinical development strategy and thinking about, and then you bring in sometimes, um, you'll bring in your preclinical, your translational science people, because you know what? They're now thinking outside the box. They're saying, okay,
Mhm.
you want to look at that drug for this, but based on the mechanism of action, there's 10 other indications that you could also develop this in.
Okay.
And I can look at the animal models and the preclinical work and what's out there right now to come back to you guys here at the table and say, not only can you do this, but once you finish that, there's a whole life cycle,
Mhm.
that a pipeline advancement,
Yeah.
we call it, to advance the product pipeline.
Mhm.
So there's a whole aspect. So there's a lot
That's
of
really cool.
people.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people that come to the table, and an
Mhm.
incredible, it's interesting to me when people don't understand the pharmaceutical and biotech industry, and they think,
That's a
okay, a
bad
drug,
rap, doesn't it?
yeah, people think that, it's out there and companies charge money, but what they don't understand is the hundreds upon hundreds of
Yeah.
people, both from vendor side, academia side, physicians, study nurse coordinators, industry people within the industry, and all those functions I named to you,
Yeah.
and then some. Finance,
I just
everybody.
think generally most people don't just understand like the time and money it takes to bring
It's the
a
work and the
drug
heart.
to trial. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the work in the heart. And what people don't understand is every function is important, and they give their effort to developing a drug, especially a drug for rare disease. And
Yeah.
when it fails, because drugs mostly fail, when
Right.
they fail, it's devastating. And what also people don't understand is, in order to advance research and development and advance science and medicine, it's incredibly expensive because you have to pay all of those people
Definitely.
that I just named and then some.
Yeah.
And why do you do that? Because the FDA and regulatory agencies require you to do things that are incredibly stringent. Their job is to protect the welfare and safety of human beings. So we have to follow all of their guidelines, every single sequential testing step,
Yeah.
and it costs money to do. Nobody wants to spend money that they don't need to spend in
Right.
research and development, right? Because they know that you have to recoup some of that money. The
Mhm.
companies, pharmaceutical companies have to recoup money so that they can continue to invest
Yeah.
in doing
I'm
research and
gonna I'm
development.
gonna just ask a really basic question then, because
Yeah.
like why at the company you were at did they decide to, have PMM as their drug target, you could say?
Because when they came across the compound,
But like strictly from a business standpoint, I don't know if that.
it wasn't a business standpoint. It was a bunch of
Mhm.
rich
Yeah,
investors in
yeah,
healthcare who were looking at a bunch of compounds that were sitting at big pharma. Because this
mhm,
is what happens, right? Big
yeah,
pharma will buy out small companies, and
yeah,
small companies might have three compounds,
mhm,
but big pharma is only buying one of the three, and then they inherit two other ones where science has been done, but
mhm,
they decide they don't want to deal with it. So
mhm,
what investors do, and especially private investors in healthcare and in this industry, is that they'll go looking for, they send their BDP, their business development people out, they go looking for these compounds that have really been flushed from a
Yeah.
preclinical and a science. Like there's work that's been good work that's been done. Why
Yeah.
do you want to do that? Because why would you take a drug brand new and spend money and start doing science all
Yeah.
over again
You
when the
don't want to
science,
reinvent the wheel, right? Yeah.
no, right, when good science has already been done and there's a potential. So
Yeah.
that's essentially how this came about. They looked at a bunch of assets.
Yeah.
They pulled in a team, which my boss, the chief medical officer, was a key part of that team. I wasn't there at the time. You know, I
Mhm.
came on after they made the decision, and they acquired the asset to develop. But my boss basically said, okay, you know what? Based on how the drug works, the mechanism of action, right?
Yeah.
This is, it's a small molecule compound. And what we believe it does is it stimulates nuclear receptors, DNA receptors that are instrumental in, you know, the fatty acid oxidation metabolic pathway, right? To stimulate ATP production. Okay. So what diseases occur in which ATP production is impacted, adversely impacted? So there you go, PMM,
Right.
right? It's an ATP problem,
Right.
right? That's how that came about. And sometimes in big pharma, it comes from the chemist. It comes from their
Yeah.
discovery group that's tinkering around in a lab. And
Yeah.
then they're saying, okay, and then they have to take it through the internal process of meeting with a bunch of people and justifying why they want it, you know. So
Yeah.
how, so I want to answer the question about from a
Yeah.
business perspective. How do
Yeah.
you decide? It varies. There's not one strategy or
Yeah.
answer
It's
to
like
how you go
everyone
about it.
involved has to have, like you said, sort of speak the same language and also be able to recognize how what they're doing can be scaled
It
up.
has to make sense. It
Yeah.
has to be sensible across strategy,
Yeah.
commercial strategy, clinical strategy, regulatory strategy, you know, preclinical, translational. It has to make sense. Like, you know, if your regulatory people are telling you this is not going to work from a regulatory landscape, and your commercial is telling you, but we want to do this, and the clinical people are telling you, I really can't do it,
Yeah.
it's not going to work, right? So that's why you bring all the people that you need to bring into a room.
Mhm.
um and there is an incredible amount of thinking.
Yeah.
And you know, and it's not just business, it's all, a lot of it is based on, and this is what people don't fully understand,
Mhm.
it's based on science, it's based on data, it's
Yeah.
based on, you know, we don't do things that
Yeah.
are not based on good science, and
Yeah.
that's really important.
Right.
And that's why sometimes I think when people view pharmaceutical and biotech, they think it's just these big sort of,
Yeah.
you know, money making machines
They
that are out
probably,
there trying to, you know, but
yeah.
the thing, stand behind this because I know how expensive it is and how long it takes to develop a drug. And the more time it takes to develop a drug, the company's eating into their patent. So
Right.
the less opportunity for them to actually recoup and make money off of that drug.
Because the
And
patent game is pretty much just you have like a set amount of time to make a
yeah,
discovery, right? Pretty
right,
much.
right. And because it takes so long to develop drugs, that, you know, a business strategy now is for small companies to go and pick up assets from large companies for
Yeah.
which work already has been done,
Yeah.
that they can now, you know, negotiate sort of to acquire the license from like a Pfizer or a big company to
Yeah.
then take into a small company, form a company and develop the drug
Yeah.
for an indication that maybe Pfizer's not interested in because they have a bajillion, you know, indications and things they're interested in, other things.
This is
So,
going to sound like the wrong question to ask just based on how you explained PMM becoming the drug target. But would you mind returning maybe to just like the basic science, I guess you could say, of how the drug you were involved with like works and how did it like actually target the mitochondria? And totally fine if, it's like a simple answer. I just like am curious.
yeah, so I think it's very complex, and this is a better question for a translational scientist,
Sure,
actually. But the
sure.
simple answer and the most important answer is simply this: it
Mhm.
stimulates what we call nuclear mitochondrial DNA. So when you think of a cell, there's mitochondrial DNA and then there's nuclear DNA. It actually stimulates the nuclear DNA
That is
receptors.
one of the real interesting parts about it. It's not because what you said before, just to like shine a light on it, it's like you inherit the maternal mitochondrial DNA, but you also have
Mhm.
the nuclear DNA.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. So it's a conundrum. So
Yeah,
this was a drug. This is it, and it's actually really smart that you picked that up because actually there were a lot of people I've worked with that didn't pick that up. So it's a mitochondrial DNA defect, but the
right,
drug works on the nuclear
right.
DNA, right? So that was always a conundrum.
Mhm.
It was a conundrum that we didn't have an answer for, and we didn't need to. And the FDA doesn't care as long as the drug works, quite honestly. Oh, by the way, let me just say that there are many drugs on the market for which the mechanism of action is unknown and has not been elucidated, okay?
Right.
That regulatory agencies have approved because there's a clinical benefit and it's gone
That
through.
that's largely because clinical trials are mostly just concerned about like the occurrence of adverse events, right? They're not,
And clinical benefit, right?
yeah,
So
they're looking
basically,
at it from like the person, like the whole organism perspective, pretty much.
right, because you may never get to understanding how the mechanism of action of the drug works, because the underlying mechanisms that contribute to the disease may be many. And what are you going to chase down? Are you going to chase down doing a bunch of work and spending a bunch of time in research in a lab in animals and mice and everything? Or
Yeah.
are you going to do enough to give you good enough science to inform your thinking to move into the clinical development pathway and program and start actually testing it in patients and seeing if there's a benefit for patients? And then you want to always ensure that it's safe and
Yeah.
tolerable, right? So those are the two things that you need to ensure with your drug. So yeah, so what I said was
Yeah.
simply it's a PPAR delta agonist. So what it does is it's an agonist, so it amps up something, right? So
Mhm.
it basically stimulates nuclear DNA receptors that
Right.
are involved, right? And indicated in sort of really amping up the oxidative phosphorylation aspect, metabolic pathway of ATP production. There are
Yeah.
different activities, right?
Yeah.
Cascading events, but
Yeah.
it was really specifically the oxidative phosphorylation
Mhm.
um, aspect of it,
Cool.
right? In these patients,
Yeah.
and how do you measure that clinically in PMM? So you measure it through exercise intolerance and fatigue, right? So PMM, so
Is pretty much at the end of the day like the
yeah,
energy, right? Yeah.
that's what you're looking at. So for us, when you're looking at primary mitochondrial myopathies, even
Mhm.
though patients have brain involvement, cognitive involvement, GI involvement, cardiac involvement, the drug was not looking at those things. The
Right.
drug was looking very specifically at fatigue and
Right.
at exercise intolerance,
Which
right? Based on the
comes back
mechanism of
to,
action.
yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
in that case, it would be like a pre-clinical trial, right? And it's like pretty much depends on what you're defining the criteria as for what you're
So
measuring.
it's translational science, right? So it's
Okay, so it's
looking
not.
at so translational science, you can study oxidative phosphorylation, ATP sort of production. You can do it in vitro, so in cell lines,
Mhm.
right? Or you can do it in vivo, in
Yeah,
animal. Like
yeah,
if you find a really good mouse model that you
yeah,
could do it in, like a where you have like a pole gene knockout. You're
yeah,
knocking out a gene and you're trying to test it.
yeah,
So you're testing the mechanism there.
yeah.
And then how you test the mechanism in humans is through biomarkers. So you're
Right.
looking at sort of biomarkers,
Interesting you
you
bring that
know,
up.
yeah, right. So you're looking at biomarkers. And so biomarkers is a big thing right now because it provides what you call the sort of supportive or confirmatory evidence, mechanistic evidence to your clinical evidence,
Right,
right? So nowadays it's a big thing. Like back in the day when I first started doing research in industry, we didn't bother with biomarkers or anything. Now
right.
it's like the big thing. So
There's two things just because, mitochondrial research, I would say, is like such a cool and emerging field, I would say, in terms of its applications. The first thing I'd like to ask is, um, I mean, you're probably aware of this, but like there's like research that's been done that's like kind of looking at it almost from like the opposite perspective, where they're using the mitochondrial like energy consumption just as a way to diagnose like cancer cells because of how
mhm,
the energy metabolism is different for cancer cells than normal cells.
mhm.
um is that something like is are those ideas discussed, like you're saying, like the people in the room at the table, right? Like in terms of business, could you like somehow when you're designing these drugs, could you make it design it in a way that you're like doing two things in parallel where you're like, because to me it's like all mitochondria, right? Like it'd be cool if you could somehow do both at once.
So it depends on what you want the drug to do. So
Mhm.
it all goes back down to the intent and what it is that you expect the drug to do in any given scenario, whether it's in a disease or whether what you're trying to kind of touch on, which is using it as a predictor
Mhm.
of, whatever it is you want relative to whatever, oncologic therapeutic indication is. A predictor of
I
what?
guess to use your language, it's like you're using the entire mitochondria itself as like a biomarker, pretty much.
You could, and I think that's a different way of thinking about it, right? And so that's kind of what researchers do,
Right.
right? So that's kind of, and I think a lot of it comes out of the lab first,
Mhm.
like the translate, so when you think about sort of, kind of what you want to do,
Right.
right? There's what I do, which is the industry side,
Mhm.
and then there's the sort of the phenomenal translational
Yeah.
work, which I think is brilliant, by the way. It's like the people who
Yeah.
do
So
that
do
work.
I. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's exciting. So I happen to work with our head of translational science very closely on
Mhm.
looking at indications beyond my primary. I mean, we were looking for our drug at indications for um oh my gosh, I'm trying to think, like cardiovascular, for kidney, for all kinds of things.
Mhm.
And I mean, we came up with a list of like at least 100
Yeah.
where there was already some in vitro in vivo data where,
Right.
okay, like once we get through this, what else can we do to basically advance the product pipeline? So to me, I think your question is like you
It's
could go
very
anywhere.
theoretical for sure.
Yeah,
Yeah. It's not
you
business.
can go anywhere with anything.
Yeah.
Okay, you can go anywhere with anything. So
Yeah.
what it comes down to is research. It comes down to, and there's always somebody out there who's interested in some aspect of something. You just need
Right.
to find them.
Right.
You need to find who that person is, and this is why we call them
Yeah.
clinical or scientific experts. You
Yeah.
need to find them, and you know what? What you might find is, for the last 13 years, they've been tinkering
Mhm.
with this concept, and now you want to partner with them to take it forward,
That's
right?
cool.
Yeah. So I think with the mitochondria, all I can say about this is it's big. It's
Yeah.
it's it's a lot. I mean, it's complex. There's a lot there. You can go many places with it. And
Mhm.
so this is where sort of the wave of the future is, right? And what you want to do with it.
There is just one last thing I'd like to point out about it, which I think makes your drug seem cooler and more different, I guess you could say. Um, Something that's also being done with the mitochondria is like during IVF, you can actually just like transfer like someone else's, normal mitochondria
Hmm.
to somebody that, is potentially going to inherit some mitochondrial
Yep.
errors from their mom.
Hmm.
But
So you know what? There's
like
a
you
lot
said,
of
it's your drug is more interesting in a way because it's targeting the nuclear DNA.
Yeah, but the thing about this drug that I worked on, it
Mhm.
doesn't address the underlying genetic defect, right? So what you're talking about is coming straight in and
Right.
trying to
It's sort
address
of
the
like,
underlying genetic defect. And you know what that's called, right? That's called gene therapy.
yeah.
So that's a whole nother area that I don't know anything about,
No,
but
that's
that
fine. I
is,
just wanted
yeah.
to point it out.
Yeah, but that is like that's gene editing. So there
Mhm.
are gene editing and gene therapies out there for what they call now precision medicine. They're trying to really hone in, and even treating patients nowadays, cancer patients, it's all
Mhm.
around precision medicine and
Mhm.
honing in and treating their specific disease and
Right.
condition based on, the genetic component of it, the clinical manifestations, the progression, everything else, right, around it. So,
Mhm.
but that whole area of gene therapy and gene editing, which I know nothing about, is
Mhm.
I think absolutely
Right.
fascinating. And I think it's something you should explore and just learn about.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome. I guess to be honest, I feel like we've had a pretty good conversation. One question that is probably something like nobody, can answer, but I just want to hear maybe your thoughts on it. Speaking as like someone entering the job market as a genetic counselor,
Mhm.
see that do you see that area like actually expanding quite a lot? Because from the lens of industry, right? Invitae filed for bankruptcy, right? And,
Mhm.
all of those industry genetic counselors lost their jobs, and now they're competing with incoming classes for the same amount of jobs, right? So currently, that's like a big hot topic where I'm coming from as a
Mhm.
student. Um, what is your advice in general or specifically for genetic counseling on, not getting like bogged down by like current news headlines and stuff like that? In
I mean,
terms,
I think first and foremost, you have to do your own research, right? So
Mhm,
I think keeping up to speed with, again, I'm going to go back to the genetic landscape,
mhm,
right? So your job could be at an academic institution in the genetics department.
mhm,
Your job could be at a genetics lab, right? Which, there was a time when I remember it used to be one. The first one came along, then the second one, and you're like, oh my God. Now I think the market is a little bit more saturated. There's
mhm,
more, right? And so kind of the need for, and they're all kind of doing the same thing and they're trying to differentiate
right,
their panels and all this stuff, for sequencing. But honestly, it's just getting um so I think that's where you're starting to see the industry being impacted from the genetic lab side of things, right? Because now it's saturated. It's more of a saturated market than being new and novel. So I
right,
think that's but you know what? There's still labs. There are still labs that need people to collaborate with. The third thing is, do you want to go into your own independent consulting?
right. That was the
Because
question I was gonna ask you is like
yeah.
how, I guess, viable of a business you could say would be starting like a private practice as a genetic counselor. And I'll make you aware, I don't know if you are aware that genetic counselors, like, they're not covered by insurance, like their genetic testing that we order
Mhm,
and all that. So
mhm.
we're pretty much where nurses were like, decades ago before they could like have billable hours in hospitals.
So my advice to you for that is, I wouldn't know how to answer that, how viable
Sure,
it is.
yeah.
What you need to do is go
Yeah,
track down the people who have private
mhm,
genetic counseling businesses,
right.
ping them on LinkedIn,
I'm
and just say,
planning on having,
yeah, ping
interviews
them
with
on
those
LinkedIn and
people as
just say,
well.
I'm a student
Mhm,
at so-and-so school in this program. And, I just really was hoping if I could have an hour or 45 minutes of your time
mhm,
to just really learn about what you do. And kind of, as I'm thinking about sort of career options going
mhm.
forward. So that's how I would handle that because they're probably going to be able to tell you better than anyone else.
That's
You
great
know,
advice. Thank
yeah.
you. Yeah. Yeah, I guess all of those are all of like the heavy hitter questions I wanted to ask. Do you feel like I should have asked anything else about any of the crazy things we talked about so far?
No, I think you asked some really great questions that were, sort of spot on. I think um I think you're in week one of
Yeah,
your master's program, you
yeah,
know, and you're going to learn. You're going to continue to learn sort of about, again, I'm going to go back to the word genetic landscape. I'm totally making it up,
that's
but
fine.
that's how I see it because it
Yeah,
just encompasses everything. And
yeah,
within that everything, you're going to have to figure out where you want to spend your time. You
yeah,
may want to start broad, but eventually you're going to have to hone in
yeah,
on
yeah,
what aspects of it you really want to spend your time chasing down and learning
mhm,
about and exploring, and then gaining some real world experience in.
yeah,
Getting yourself, volunteer, do it through an internship, do it through, but whatever it is you want to do, you're going to have to gain some real world practical experience.
yeah,
And if you can do it
definitely.
through your program and they support it and there are resources to support it, great.
Yeah,
Do it through, but however you do it,
yeah,
figure out how to do that.
mhm.
Um, because that's going to be key. And that's also going to be key when you come out and try to apply for a job.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So I think that's going to be really important.
Mhm.
You asked really, I'm surprised actually, you asked really good questions around the mitochondrial disorder and PMM
Cool.
because
Okay.
especially the mechanism of action around the nuclear DNA, because I'm telling you that was a big conundrum that there were even people I worked with that didn't quite get. So
Yeah,
the fact that you were able to hone in on that, I'm actually quite impressed. So
thanks. That's
I
nice.
mean, the caveat is the other people are like business people and they're not,
Yeah,
your background and thing, but still, it was a really important aspect of the mechanism of action of the drug.
Yeah.
relative to the disease itself. So I think that was really good. No, I mean, I think this was I think you did a great job asking really good questions.
Yeah, I definitely learned a lot. I know you kind of are volunteering your time. Do you have anyone that comes to mind right off the top of your head that you think I should interview next, besides those people on LinkedIn? And
Yeah, so I can let me think about that a little bit and see where they are. I actually think looking into also patient advocacy groups,
yeah,
and I think is like UMDF,
uh,
and maybe yeah, let me talk to some people and see kind of where they're at, because I haven't talked to some people in a while, so I don't know where they're what they're doing, but I think there are people that are related to sort of patient advocacy groups, I think that are really important because they have such a huge role in moving this field forward
right.
as well. And quite honestly, even from a regulatory standpoint, a business standpoint,
Yeah.
the patient voice in clinical trials and taking them to the FDA in your regular FDA meetings
Mhm.
is huge. I didn't realize how impactful that patient voice was until I started working in rare disease and
Yeah,
how the rest of the world views that patient voice.
right.
So I think one of the things I would encourage you to do is really understand the role of patient advocacy. And
Mhm.
like I said, if you're curious about mitochondrial UMDF, that
Oh,
is the ultimate advocacy group in the
cool.
States. And then
Yeah,
there's a bunch of other ones, by the way, in Europe and around the world.
cool.
So
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, it's like stuff like this that, I can read a book, but it's really great to just be able to talk to someone who's been doing it for so long.
mm, yeah, no, I'm happy to help out.
Yeah,
So
thank you.
yeah, anytime you have a question, you feel free to reach out to me.
Sweet. Awesome. Thank
Okay.
you.
All
Uh,
right.
Alrighty. I'm
All right,
gonna
Karen,
end
have a
the,
good,
yeah, you as well.
have some fun.
Thanks.
All right. Bye.
Bye.